You also in that same allegation use terms like the splashing the cash. Do you consider that use of that language is demeaning towards Davidson?
No. Again, I think the suggestion that that's demeaning is utterly ridiculous. I mean, splashing the cash, and that's just a casual slang term. It's not. I mean, to be honest, I just find it utterly bizarre and ridiculous that I'm sitting here having to defend using the term splashing the cash. I mean, really, is this the best we've got? I mean, I can't even bother answering that question. It's so ridiculous. I'm happy to do that. Can we just move on from that?
Do the views expressed in the 2018 video and the 2019 letter continue to reflect your views today?
Absolutely.
And having been through the GTCS investigation and now going through the fitness to teach hearing, would you publicly express these views in a similar manner in the future?
Absolutely.
I have no further questions for you, Mr. Lucas. Thank you.
Well, I've got the recording now for my recent case with the General Teaching Council for Scotland, and I thought you might like to hear a few excerpts from it. Now, I don't want to embarrass anyone who took part in it, and it's maybe not fair to show people who didn't really think they were going to end up starring in a YouTube video on the Scottish Family Party YouTube channel. So I'm not showing any other people. Sometimes when I'm asked questions, I've used a synthetic voice, as you heard already, just so you can hear the question that was asked, and then you'll see my answer to it live. Now, this process of editing and using the synthetic voice, etc., is a little bit hit and miss, and I've chopped it around a little bit. But it's just to give you the flavour of a few excerpts. Some of the images on screen are not quite right or whatever. It's a bit rough and ready, but you might find it interesting to listen to. So, here we go.
Can you confirm when you qualified as a teacher, Mr. Lucas?
1992.
So is it fair to say that you're quite an experienced teacher?
That would be fair to say.
Would it also be fair to say that in light of your experience you would be familiar with the terms of the Code of Professionalism and Conduct and the standards for registration?
Yes.
Do you accept that as a member of the teaching profession you are in a privileged position?
That sounds a bit more like an essay title. There's various ways of interpreting that. A privileged position. If the sense says the teachers should feel that the General Teaching Council has bestowed a privilege on them by allowing them to teach, I don't feel that's the correct mindset for looking at a regulatory body. I would see it more as it's not that they bestow a privilege on certain people to allow them to be teachers. It's that certain people fulfill the requirements in order to be teachers. So I wouldn't see it as a privilege in that sense. If you're meaning more broadly, is it a privilege to, for one's vocation to be to work with young people and developing them and educating them, then absolutely.
I did mean the latter. Move on to ask you some questions about the Ruth Davidson and Fatherless Children video, which is referred to as the 2018 video in the allegations, and in particular the new family structure study by Mark Regnerus that you refer to. You state with regard to 2B1-6, my presentation of the facts is temperate and matter-of-fact, and that's a paragraph that you read aloud today when you were given your evidence as well. I therefore understand your position to be that you are presenting facts in the 2018 video. Is that correct?
That section of my defense was referring to the presentation of the facts from the study. So the outcomes of that study are presented as fact. Absolutely, yes.
When you are presenting the data from the study, you describe a family structure where the mother and father were married while their child was 0 to 18 years old as an intact family. Why do you use the term intact family then?
Yes, that's right. In contrast to the other family forms that were there. Yeah. Now you could say that using the word intact compared to the same-sex parents wasn't quite the right term to use. Yeah, you could make a case that that wasn't the most accurate term to use.
And that's what you understand that term to mean, intact family.
In contrast to the other family forms that often involve some sort of family disruption and instability. For example, step families, single parents, also the same-sex families as well, that they will have included a degree of family disruption as well, as sometimes the child would have been born within one relationship and then subsequently with same-sex parents.
What do you understand that term to mean?
The primary understanding of that term would be a child being brought up by their biological parents. It's not a term that I'm using in any sort of carefully defined way, but that would be my first understanding of the term intact family. Yeah, a child being brought up by their biological parents who are still with them in the family home.
Do you agree that by using this term intact family that suggests that you prefer this type of family structure over the others?
I don't think the use of that term implies that, but I do think that. When I say prefer, I mean for the reasons I stated in the video. It's not some sort of arbitrary matter of taste, but for the reasons I presented, I do feel it is the ideal family form, yes.
So would you agree that using the term intact family implies that you're more favorable towards this type of family structure compared, for example, to the family structures where the mother had a lesbian relationship and the father had a homosexual relationship?
Right, I think that's, if I may say so, I think that's a bit of a devious question. You're trying to lead me into implicating myself that I would treat people in a more favorable way. So you're trying to move things from me saying, this is the favorable form of, this is the form of family I favor, in order to, would you favor them? In other words, would you treat them in a different manner? So I think I'll clarify very clearly. I do favor children being brought up by their biological families. But when I say I favor it, that means that's the ideal. But I would not treat them with favoritism or treat other people disfavorably as a result of that, just to clarify.
Were you aware at that time that the new family structure study was published in 2012?
Yes, I was.
Why did you not mention this in the video?
Why should I? Okay, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say it's not for me to ask a question. So your implication is that I was deliberately quoting out-of-date research in order to deceive people that was out of date. So this is just 6 years old. 6 years old. I mean, that's pretty recent research. I don't think there have been dramatic changes in society that would render such research null and void. So I really don't think that there's any case to answer, if you like, about the fact that I didn't mention it was from 2012.
And so can I just check what your answer to that question is? Why was this not mentioned in the video?
Because I didn't feel it was relevant.
I'd be very grateful if I could ask the servicing officer to play a short section of the 2018 video.
Now, needless to say, Mark Regnerus, the researcher, has been absolutely vilified. His research has been challenged on all sorts of grounds.
Mr. Lucas, you were aware in 2018 that the new family structure study had been challenged?
Yes.
Were you aware that 200 members of the academic community wrote to the academic journal that published the study making a number of criticisms about it?
Yes.
Were you aware that one of the criticisms made in that letter was the period between the submission of the paper and its acceptance was very short, so the peer review process took place very quickly?
Yes. I don't recall that specific thing. I'd like to speak about this issue more generally at some point if you gave me the opportunity, but I'll answer your questions. Yeah, Karen.
Were you with another criticism made was that 2 of the academics who peer-reviewed the paper were active participants in the new family structure study, questioning their independence? Were you aware that Mark Regeneris was also criticized for comparing participants whose mother and father were married with participants whose mother and father had a lesbian relationship or whose father had a homosexual relationship, even although those relationships may have ended in divorce?
Right. Well, I'm going to answer these questions more broadly. You can obviously see the direction of travel. So the suggestion is that this research was criticized, which it was criticized. Now, the way things happen, it's a bit like, the way the General Teaching Council sort of attacks me because I expressed the wrong views. The same sort of things happens in academia as well. So when a sociologist publishes research that contradicts the usual left liberal secular narrative, this is what happens. There's a sort of academic pylon, and people sign letters, they try and get them banned, they attack the publisher, they attack the peer reviewers, they attack everyone worked on it, they try and get the bloke fired, they try and stop him getting papers published. That's just the way it is in sociology. Okay. Now, if you want to look into this more, I recommend this book that I referred to in the video, The Sacred Project of American Sociology by Christian Smith, published by Oxford University Press. And in this book, he talks about the response to Mark Regnerus's New Family Structures study. And he talks about the way that it was very unfair, the double standards that were applied. And to be honest, it's quite a big issue. I mean, I'll be happy to give, an hour's presentation on the issue if you'd like, but I don't think this is probably the place for it. But I would say that, for Oxford University Press, there's a very credible case that the reaction to it was not justified on the grounds of genuine concerns about the credibility of the research. It was more ideologically driven. Now, if someone were wanting to take a different view to me on that, I would say it's absolutely fine, but I don't think people should be struck off for taking a different side in an academic discussion in the field of social science.
Just check with you. Thank you Mr. Lucas for that. Okay, to check with you what your answer to the question is, where are you aware of that criticism about comparing participants whose mother and father were married with participants whose mother and father had a lesbian or a homosexual relationship, even though the latter relationships may have ended in divorce or separation?
When I've looked at the criticisms of it in some detail, I wouldn't say I remember that particular one. Was I aware of it when I made the video? Very possibly.
These criticisms had prompted an internal audit by the academic journal that published the study.
Yes, I say I'm fully. There's things in this book. So could I add something to that point as well? You'll see in my documentation, I explicitly invite criticism of these matters. I say I'd be happy to expand on them if a case is presented, but nothing has been presented to me in the almost 3 years of this case, and now it's coming out with no prior warning, no documentation. I say I'll be happy to, if you want me to talk about this for an hour tomorrow, I'll be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you. If I could refer you back to the video, and I'm happy to take you to the relevant sections if that would be of a system, so please do let me know. But you spend around 3 minutes of it taking us through the data in respect to the study and approximately 7 seconds mentioning that it was challenged. Why is that?
Well, the suggestion of your question is there should be some sort of proportionality conclusion that therefore, because what I was doing was presenting the content of the study, the findings of the study. That was the important thing. And I've already explained that the criticisms of it, I believe, are largely, if not wholly, motivated by ideological opposition rather than genuine scientific reservations. So I mentioned them, and I also mentioned, as I say, I explained in the video that this is what happens, that the person just gets vilified and attacked. It's a parallel to what's happening to me in the General Teaching Council of Scotland. The same thing happens to universities, to sociologists. Whereas with the General Teaching Council of Scotland, it's a threat to your registration because you said the wrong thing. In the sociology world, then the same type of attitude expresses itself in the way that Mark Regnerus was treated. Just to say about Mark Regnerus as well, he's a couple of books here that were published by Oxford University Press just in the last couple of years. So if your suggestion is this is some sort of a discredited maverick, I'm quoting, I think that is entirely erroneous.
No, I'm just asking of a 15-minute video why you pay lip service for 7 seconds about the challenges that were faced by Mark Regnerus.
Now, use the term lip service. That means that you just talk about it even though you don't really want to and it's not really sincere or whatever. I would say I openly discussed the evidence. I also stated that it had been challenged, and I gave my interpretation of the fact that it had been challenged and the motivations for why it was challenged. So in other words, I expressed the view of Christian Smith in this book by Oxford University Press. If that renders me unfit to teach, then so be it. But I was just expressing the point of view expressed in that book. One side of the academic debate, the minority side, the unfashionable side of the academic debate, but one side of the academic debate.
If I could please refer you to the statement made in the 2018 video, which is set out to allegation 2C1, which is the statistics always show worse outcomes for children from lesbian and gay parented households, but then the statistical jiggery-pokery kicks in, and by controlling for one thing or another eventually you can make those effects disappear and claim that the children turn out just as well. There's good reason to think that there are problems associated with correlated with same-sex parenthood or words to that effect. How can the statistics always show worse outcomes for children from lesbian and gay parented households? I'm sure this can't always be the case.
Right, I would say my statement there is very compressed. We're dealing with a very complex and wide-ranging issue that involves a lot of statistical and scientific matters. And my presentation of it in this video, I say, is extremely compressed. Now, the view you said there, again, you'd find that view reflected in Christian Smith's publication there. Now, I would say my language there was not entirely accurate. I wouldn't say the studies always find that. There are some that don't, but the general picture is with a lot of studies, they find that the outcomes are worse for the children of same-sex parents, but then by controlling for example, relational stability, those effects can be removed by bringing them below statistical significance, for example. I mean, would you like me to explain more about what I mean by that, or do you understand that, about controlling for variables?
That sounds fine, Mr. Lucas. I'm happy to move on that basis. Do you agree that this suggests that every social study comes to that conclusion that you report in the video by saying always show worse outcomes from lesbian and gay parented households? Do you agree that that suggests to the viewer that every social science study comes to that same conclusion?
The conclusion of social science studies is a combination of the data and the statistical analysis. Can
you answer the question, please?
Yes, that's what I'm doing. In the majority of cases, then I've been informed. I mean, I don't read this social science research. For example, Christian Smith there in his book, published by Oxford University Press, he's of the view that that's the usual turn of events, that the raw data shows worse outcomes in one way or another for the children with same-sex parents, but then controlling for relational instability can mask that effect or bring it below statistical significance. So therefore, the overall conclusion of the study would show that there's no difference or little difference between them. So I would emphasize my purpose in this video was not to go into this matter in great depth. I was just trying to give a little snapshot of the issues involved in there, the controversies involved, and the way that statistics, I wouldn't say manipulated, but with social science, there are a lot of options in how to analyze the statistics. There is the phrase in social science, well, in statistics in general, if you torture the data for long enough, it'll tell you what you want to hear. And some people suggest that in the area of research for same-sex parenting, that is what happens in many cases.
Looking though at that statement that you've made at allegation 2C1, would you agree that it's a demeaning statement?
Demeaning? Absolutely not.
That statement's not just a reference to the facts though, is it, Mr. Lucas? I would say that the statement in its totality I'd like you to look at. Okay, so this is statistics always show worse outcomes for children from lesbian gay parented households, but then the statistical jiggery poker kicks in, and by controlling for one thing or another eventually you can make these effects disappear and claim that the children turn out just as well. But there's good reason to think that there are problems correlated with same-sex parenthood.
Okay, so this is statistics always show worse outcomes for children from lesbian gay parented households, but then the statistical jiggery pokery kicks in, and by controlling for one thing or another, eventually you can make these effects disappear and claim that the children turn out just as well. But there's good reason to think that there are problems correlated with same-sex parenthood. I don't see anything remotely demeaning in that. I would wonder what your definition of demeaning is, if you think that's demeaning.
You're referring that statement to statistical jiggery pokery. What do you mean by that?
As I explained earlier, within statistical analysis, particularly in social science, there are a lot of options available to academics in the way they interpret their data. And there's a lot of leeway in order to choose statistical techniques that are going to lead to particular outcomes. And in very highly charged, controversial, politicized issues, there is a tendency for the academics to choose the statistical analysis techniques that produce the results that fit in with their own worldview and don't get them fired, for example.
I think that you had said earlier that if you torture the data long enough, it'll tell you what you want to hear.
Yes, that's a well-known phrase in the academic world, yes.
Is that an example of statistical jiggery-pokery?
Yes. Okay, I'll expand on that a little bit more to give you some idea. So if you find results, for example, that let's say educational outcomes for children of same-sex parents are not as good as for children of heterosexual parents. Let's say you start with that data. What the sociologists can then do is control for relational stability. So in other words, that they'll, from another source, they'll find out what amount of that effect is actually due to relational stability. And then they'll take that into account. And having done that, it might appear that there are not statistically significant differences between the two groups. But what that masks is the fact that relational stability is at a higher level within the same-sex couples. So what's happening is the same-sex couples have, their children have less good academic outcomes. And part of the reason for that might be because of relational instability. But some people argue, well, that relationship instability is to do with being a same-sex couple. And other people might argue, well, actually, no, it's not to do with being a same-sex couple, so we should discount it. Then that's a value judgment to go into there. But the result of that is it gives quite a bit of leeway to academics in how they analyze their statistics. And so I think anyone looking at them with a critical eye will bear that in mind when looking at the results.
I think that I had asked you earlier about whether you were aware that Mark Regeneris's own study was criticized for not taking into account relational stability.
And I've just explained that this is often a tricky decision, what you control for and what you don't control for. Again, to give an example, if you are doing a study about the danger of guns, okay, if you do research on it and control for how many bullets get fired, then you could reach the conclusion that guns are not dangerous at all. It's just the number of bullets that get fired. That's the thing. So just to show that these are very important decisions to be made within academic statistical analysis, within academic studies. And they're not easy decisions. And there is a lot of leeway for researchers to make decisions that reflect their own ideological beliefs, shall we say.
And if I could ask you about the specific use of the phrase statistical jiggery-pokery which you've used here when describing the interpretation of the data. Would you agree that it is an offhand and demeaning term to use?
Yes, I would. Yeah, I would say that is a little bit. Well, I wouldn't say it's maybe slightly offensive to social scientists, but it's more a sharp criticism of social scientists who misuse statistical techniques in a way that's not that shows a lack of integrity. But I'm not sure if this is in any way relevant to the allegations or whatever. Anyway.
Well, I'm looking at the meaning and effect of the language that you've used in the video.
Yeah, that's very important. But I am not. The allegations is not that I've been a bit rude to social scientists and statistical analysts. And that's what the statistical jiggery-pokery is referring to. So as far as I'm concerned, that's irrelevant. But yeah.
So are you suggesting in this statement that any interpretation of data which shows no correlation between same-sex parenting and worse outcomes for children has been the subject of statistical jiggery-pokery?
Not necessarily, but in a lot of cases, and an awful lot of cases, that would be the case. Yeah.
Do you not think that that is demeaning to same-sex parents?
No, in the same way that saying that pupils in less well-off areas don't perform as well at school, for example, that's not demeaning to people who live in less well-off areas.
And in your view, in those studies, the effects would also be subjected to statistical jiggery-pokery?
When we're talking about the effect of the outcomes for children in different socioeconomic areas. Yeah. No, I don't think there would be a great deal of statistical jiggery-pokery, because I don't think this is a highly politicized and controversial field. So I would imagine social scientists of any political equation would be quite willing to follow the evidence where it leads and just to present a straightforward analysis of it. So I think that would be a very different area. But there are many areas where they are politicized, and this might be an issue.
You also in that statement use at 2C1 the phrase controlling for one thing or another. Would you agree that the use of that phrase is offhand and dismissive?
I feel that that suggestion is utterly ridiculous. Absolutely laughable and ridiculous. I'm sorry, but that's my answer to that question. Controlling, I mean, do you know what controlling means? Do you know what that means in a statistical context? Controlling for one thing or another.
The questions are for you to answer. They're not for me to answer.
Sorry.
It's just, if you understood what I'm saying, if you actually understood what I was saying, then I would imagine you would realize that your question was just completely ridiculous.
So you're not suggesting there that there is a manipulation of data to show a particular outcome for the children of same-sex parents?
I've already answered, I've spoken about that at some length now.
Well, it just strikes me that this is another use of a similar phraseology, controlling for one thing or another.
Controlling for one thing or another. So choosing one or another other parameter in the research as a control value, as a statistical method. I mean, I honestly don't, it's so ridiculous, I don't know what to say. You need to give some explanation of what you think the problem is with it, and then I could respond to it. But at face value, it's just too bizarre. I can't begin to think why you'd be asking that question.
If I ask you to focus on the language used in the terms statistical jiggery-pokery and controlling for one thing or another. It's not objective language, Mr. Lucas, is it?
Statistical jiggery-pokery is, I would say, cheeky. It's cheeky towards social scientists. And controlling for one thing or another, again, I maintain that question, the suggestion there's some problem with the language of that is just too bizarre for me even to imagine whatever you could possibly be meaning with that.
You state their male and female role models in the home are important, and that despite the best efforts of the liberal social sociology establishment to obscure the facts, the negative outcomes associated with same-sex parenting should give cause for concern. Can you explain what you mean by the phrase, despite the best efforts of the liberal social sociology establishment to obscure the facts?
Just what I've been talking about at great length in the previous questions.
So why did you use the word obscure here?
Because I think that's what does happen within the sociology academic world. That I would describe it as obscuring the facts. That although the research is not motivated by the search for the truth, it's the search for material to back up a perspective that is almost universally held within the social science world. In terms of political persuasions within different academic departments, I think in most parts of the world, you'll find within sort of maths and science there'll be maybe a reasonable split of people on the right and left of politics. As you go more into politics, history, geography, it tends to be more and more left. By the time you get to sociology, you get to the point where there's virtually no one with sort of right-leaning and conservative views, and that's why the discipline comes under suspicion in this regard. And also the fact that the steps that are taken sometimes in interpreting data have been shown, well, in my view, have been shown to be motivated by ideology rather than integrity.
Would you agree that this phrase, despite the best efforts of the liberal sociology establishment to obscure the facts, would likely be interpreted as an indication of intolerance towards same-sex parents?
I can't answer whether it's likely to be. I would say anyone who did come to that conclusion has got absolutely no reason to come to that conclusion. The person who could claim to be offended by this might be a member of the liberal sociology establishment. But again, it's not alleged that I have offended the liberal sociology establishment.
Would you agree that this phrase suggests that you're more favorable or biased towards heterosexual parents compared to same-sex parents?
I think that's a wild leap with no logic to it at all. And if anyone wanted to explain to me the connection between those, I would assess the purported reasoning. But the reasoning that links those two things is so opaque to me that I can't begin to analyze it.
The statement at 41, which starts male and female role models in the home are important despite the best fact efforts. Would you agree that that statement suggests you're more favorable or biased towards heterosexual parents compared to same-sex parents?
I think that's the same trick, if I may say so, that you were trying earlier, that I'm more favorable towards. Right, I'll state my views in my own words. My view is that natural family life is the ideal. Same-sex parenting is not ideal. And I do believe that the outcomes for children related to it give cause for concern. That's my view. It's stated perfectly clearly there.
If I could please ask you to look at allegation 2 or 3, which is another statement from the 2018 video, and it is that the Ruth Davidson and her same-sex partner haven't produced this baby together. This baby is the product of Ruth Davidson and a gentleman whose identity is a mystery to us, or words to that effect. Why did you want to draw attention to the fact that Ruth Davidson's baby is not the product of Ruth Davidson and her partner?
Well, because that's what I was talking about in the video. That was the central issue of the video. How could I have possibly made the point of the video without pointing that out?
Do you consider that this statement could be interpreted as demeaning towards Davidson and her partner?
Absolutely, categorically not. Listen to the language. Baby is the product of Ruth Davidson and a gentleman whose identity is a mystery to us. I mean, how could you phrase it more straightforwardly? It's just explaining that that's what I'm talking about. Okay, if you remember, I quoted from the Catechism of the Catholic Church earlier on, and that's fundamentally the point I'm making, is that two women having a baby with a sperm donor, that's something that's not right. Now, Ruth Davidson went in public and said, I urge lots of other people to do what I've done. So she's publicly saying same-sex couples or lesbian couples have children with a sperm donor. That's what I recommend. I come in saying, well, actually, I don't recommend that. And this is just background information about the facts of the matter. And I come along and say, well, I disagree with what Ruth Davidson was saying there. This is my perspective instead.
Do you agree that the viewer watching this video could conclude that you view homosexual relationships as inferior to heterosexual relationships because they do not directly result in pregnancy?
Could they conclude that from the video? They could very possibly deduce that that's my view, and it is indeed my view. And it is the view of the Roman Catholic Church, the mainstream Christian churches, and many other religious faiths around the world. I know to GTCS, they think it's beyond the pale, but that's a reflection of the narrowness of GTCS's perspective rather than anything that's genuinely objectionable about this view, which is held by probably the majority of people in the world.
You also state in the 2018 video, and this is the allegation 2 or 4, that now a baby box includes condoms anyway. If Nicola Sturgeon wants to give Ruth Davidson a baby box containing condoms, that's entirely up to her. Why did you make that statement?
Humorous aside, I say humor often hinges on realization of incongruity, and there is something I would say a bit amusing about the fact of giving a gift or something. Certainly giving condoms to Ruth Davidson is incongruous, so it's a humorous aside.
Do you think it's likely that you would have made that comment if Davidson was in a heterosexual relationship?
Well, of course I wouldn't, because the whole point is that the condoms are not relevant because she's in a lesbian relationship. If it was to someone in a heterosexual relationship, then the inclusion of condoms would be an entirely different issue, wouldn't it? So of course I wouldn't make the comment to someone in a heterosexual relationship.
Do you agree that the viewer of the 2018 video could conclude from hearing you make that statement that's an attempt to ridicule Ruth Davidson because she's in a same-sex relationship?
No, I don't. The butt of the joke is Nicola Sturgeon. It's Nicola Sturgeon who's doing something that could be regarded as comical in giving condoms to Ruth Davidson. The other thing I mentioned at this point, as I said earlier on, this phrase was only put in the second bite of the cherry with the allegations just a few months ago. So all the way through the first 2 years or whatever of the case, this wasn't even there. It's just popped up relatively at the last minute. But I say it's just an innocent, humorous aside based on an obvious incongruity.
But when I asked you about whether you would have made this comment if Ruth Davidson was in a heterosexual relationship, you said, well, of course I wouldn't.
You're trying to base an argument on the fact that I wouldn't have made the same joke in a situation where the joke clearly wouldn't apply. I wouldn't even describe it as a joke, say humorous aside. I mean, it's just obvious. It doesn't apply. There is something incongruous about giving the baby box containing condoms to Ruth Davidson. There's a little incongruity there. Okay. And that's what I was just pointing out as a humorous aside. So to try and draw any conclusion that I wouldn't make the same joke in a different situation in which the joke would have no content, the joke would have no meaning or content or relevance. I mean, you can't build any argument on that.
If I could ask you to look at allegation 2E5. You're referring that to Ruth Davidson and her partner's decision to postpone their wedding, and you see if finance is really the reason why Ruth Davidson and her same-sex partner did not get married, then I think it shows that Ruth Davidson seems more concerned about the wedding, the celebration, the occasion, the splashing the cash on that rather than on marriage, which is actually the important bit which costs very little. Do you agree that the use of the words Ruth Davidson seems more concerned about the wedding, the celebration, the occasion, the splashing of the cash on that rather than on marriage suggests that you disapprove of her decision to postpone her wedding?
Yes, within the context that I don't agree with same-sex marriages at all, but within this context, yes, it was disapproving of her reasons she gave for not getting married. Yeah.
Do you agree that the reasonable and properly for a member of the public watching the 2018 video would conclude that this indicates intolerance towards Ruth Davidson because she is an unmarried lesbian mother?
Now, we need to know what we mean by intolerance. If by intolerance you mean daring to express a view at odds with, then someone could call that intolerance. If you mean intolerance in terms of denying someone the right to disagree or stating that someone has to do things the way I say, or implying that there should be some sort of action taken against them or restrictions imposed on them for not doing the things the way I want, then I think with those realistic definitions of tolerance, then very definitely not. It's an expression of disagreement. Disagreement does not imply intolerance. Now, if you want to present an argument that disagreement does imply intolerance, then I'd be very happy to hear that. But as far as I'm concerned, disagreement and criticism does not imply intolerance.
You also in that same allegation use terms like the splashing the cash. Do you consider that use of that language is demeaning towards Davidson?
No. Again, I think the suggestion that that's demeaning is utterly ridiculous. I mean, splashing the cash, and that's just a casual slang term. It's not. I mean, to be honest, I just find it utterly bizarre and ridiculous that I'm sitting here having to defend using the term splashing the cash. I mean, really, is this the best we've got? I mean, I can't even bother answering that question. It's so ridiculous. I'm happy to do that. Can we just move on from that?
Do the views expressed in the 2018 video and the 2019 letter continue to reflect your views today?
Absolutely.
And having been through the GTCS investigation and now going through the fitness to teach hearing, would you publicly express these views in a similar manner in the future?
Absolutely.
I have no further questions for you, Mr. Lucas. Thank you.
During Ms. Harris's submission, I think she changed the wording of the allegation at some points in a way, I'm sure it was accidental, but in a way that might have been a bit misleading to the panel. Just like to clarify that, for example, in allegation 2D4, towards the end it says, and would discriminate against them and their children in the course of your duties as a teacher. And the key word I'd like to point out there is would, because during Ms. Harris's presentation, she substituted some other words for the word would at some points, words such as may, which obviously makes the allegation, well, in my view, a bit more reasonable. I still would dispute it, but it makes it slightly more reasonable than the actual wording. Now, Ms. Harris did say that there'd been no evidence of discrimination, that I discriminated against anyone. There's no evidence that I discriminated against anyone. According to the General Teaching Council for Scotland, there is. According to the General Teaching Council for Scotland, I have definitely discriminated against pupils and their parents. Definitely. Because they say that I hold these views that imply that I would discriminate against same-sex parents and their children. Right, I've held these views for a long, long time. I have taught children of same-sex parents. When I was a housemaster, I had a boy in the house who was the son of gay parents. So according to GTCS know, as a matter of fact, that I did discriminate against them, just on the basis of the views I hold. Now, if you regard that as cast iron logic, that you can definitely come to that conclusion on the basis of my views about family structures, then 2D part 4, allegation 2D part 4, you can regard that as proven. If you don't think you can conclude that I have definitely discriminated against children of same-sex parents in the past, then you can't accept that one. I think that's straightforward logic. Now, there's a very interesting line of reasoning taken by Miss Harris. The idea that I would treat certain pupils differently because I thought they were more prone to, for example, mental health problems. That was quite interesting. If that was the case, if it was the case, how would I treat them differently? How do you treat a child differently because you think they might be at greater risk of mental health problems or some other problems? What you do, you just keep an extra eye on them, take a bit of extra care for them? Is that the sort of special treatment you were referring to? I mean, for example, children from poorer areas would tend to have greater incidence of mental health problems. Children from single parent families would have greater incidences of mental health problems. If a teacher were to say, I'm aware of that risk factor, so I'll just keep an extra eye on them, just be, try and make sure that everything's okay. Is that the sort of discrimination that I'm accused of? I mean, if it is, it doesn't sound too sinister to me. But I'm not saying at all that I would do that. I'm not claiming that I would do that. I'm just saying I've been accused that I would do that. I'm saying if I did, that's what it might comprise of. That's what it would constitute. And it doesn't seem much of a charge as far as I'm concerned. The point was made that pupils could watch my video while their views were developing. Let's just let that sink in for a while. In other words, pupils could come across the teaching of the Catholic Church and mainstream Christian denominations while their views were developing. That's a real danger. That's really, alarm bells ring, don't they? When you think about the possibility of pupils coming across the teachings of the Catholic Church while their views are developing, we've really got to stop that happening, haven't we? That really would be a disaster if pupils came to understand that. So we're going to assume the alternative is GTCS's position is that pupils should definitely not hear these other perspectives while their own views are developing. Own views? I don't think so. While the views that are pushed to them in virtually every lesson they're in at school and for the government and GTCS and Education Scotland, that's all fine. But the alternative view, that's got to be eliminated completely from young people's experience. I mean, what sort of country are we in here, if that's the line that's been taken? But another word that was used was targeting. I'm targeting same-sex parents. What do you think about when you think of targeting? You think of, a bow and arrow, firing a gun, deliberately aiming at someone, something aggressive. I targeted same-sex parents. That word is completely inappropriate. I chose as a topic for the video to talk about issues relating to same-sex parenting. Okay, to describe that as targeting makes it something like, it's a bit aggressive and unpleasant. But it was presenting something based on that topic. Similarly, I singled out Ruth Davidson, created the impression there was lots of people, and I picked on her, for no good reason, just out of prejudice. Ruth Davidson made a public statement arguing in favor of her philosophy of parenthood, sexuality, etc. She made a public statement about that. I responded. Okay, that's as simple as that. And in terms of tone as well, I think Miss Harris used some terms such as my tone was disapproving, my tone was critical. And I would say, maybe, disapproving, critical. Yeah, is there anything wrong with that? Is there anything wrong with being disapproving, critical, for that coming across in the tone? I can't see a problem with that. at all. At the very end of Miss Harris's presentation, she referred to protecting the rights of same-sex parents, children of same-sex parents. I would be fascinated to know what these rights are that I'm allegedly infringing. I'm not aware of the right to not be disagreed with. I'm not aware of the right not to be criticized. I'm not aware of the right not to hear alternative perspectives. Okay, I think rights was just thrown in as, it makes it sound really serious, makes it sound as if he's doing something that's really going to harm these people, infringing their rights. But I really don't know what rights are in mind there. And also he suggested that a child merely knowing the content of my views might find that problematic, being in my class, for example. Now, my response to that, just to clarify it, I'm not sure how clearly I made it, is just to point out that in Scotland, there are a lot of children who come from families whose values are very much at odds with the Scottish educational establishment. And those children sit in the lessons. They're not just thinking, oh, I know what this teacher thinks, and it's different than my mum and dad thinks, it's different than the values of our families. They're not just thinking that because they know what the teacher said. It's that the teacher is actually teaching them this alternative perspective. And I've had many messages from pupils in schools saying they're fed up of having to sit through teachers presenting messages that are at odds with their values to them, day after day, week after week, year after year. So I think singling out my case is unfair in that regard. Right, moving on to 2E. Language, tone and manner, inflammatory, demeaned, ridiculed, insulted. Now, these things about language, they're pretty strong terms. Demeaned, well, ridiculed, insulted. I'll talk about demeaned in the submission. Inflammatory. And then when you look at the examples that are given, I mean, to be honest, they're feeble. They're feeble. Just imagine what someone could say if they're being inflammatory or if they're ridiculing. Think about the sort of extreme, foul language, derogatory terms, insults. What I said in the video was nothing like that. If you look at the things that Miss Harris had to pick out to put into the allegations, again, it really is scraping the barrel. I mean, controlling for one thing or another. I mean, am I supposed to hang my head in shame for saying something like that? I'm really not. Now, when it comes to tone and manner, it's very interesting. If some issues of tone and manner well, I'll clarify something actually. Tone can mean style of language. It can also mean facial expressions and tone of voice as well. So there's some ambiguity there. But manner, there's a charge about my manner, inflammatory manner. If my manner was inflammatory, why has Miss Harris not shown you a clip of the video and said that's the bit where his manner was inflammatory? That bit where he shook his fist, that bit where he pointed his finger aggressively at the screen, that point where he scowled and shouted at the screen. Did we have that? No. The reason we didn't have it is because it's not there. And the allegation is just fatuous, basically. So I say my case here, Miss Harris's case was submitted, an hour or two ago. My case was submitted 2 years ago to the General Teaching Council of Scotland. So the General Teaching Council of Scotland has rejected my case. But I would argue that General Teaching Council for Scotland is not a competent judge. So the panel has the opportunity to correct the error of the General Teaching Council of Scotland regarding these allegations as proved. Let's remember, the General Teaching Council of Scotland says that stating that abortion is immoral could be seen as contravening their standards. Now that means that their judgment is such that they cannot distinguish between the expression of a mainstream, acceptable view held, as say, by mainstream Christian churches. They can't distinguish that from genuinely offensive and objectionable content. They can't distinguish. And the fact that they say teachers, could be at risk for saying abortion is immoral, that demonstrates, in fact, I would say proves the fact that the General Teaching Council of Scotland its judgment is flawed in these matters. It's not competent to judge a case like this. Another proof of this incompetence of the General Teaching Council of Scotland to make a judgment in this case is that in their professional standards, they demand that teachers adhere to the left-leaning progressive political ideology known as social justice. And I've illustrated in my documentation and in my presentation that the GTCS's own presentation of the meaning of this phrase social justice is in line with left-wing, progressive, secular, liberal thought, quite clearly, which again proves, as a matter of fact, that GTCS is biased and unfit to perform its functions because it can't exercise judgment in the way it should do because of its own partiality. I mean, my view, as you will have read in my defense documents, is that this case won't reveal anything about my fitness to teach. And my view is that the very existence of this case, the fact that it's been brought to this point, demonstrates some serious flaws with the General Teaching Council for Scotland in terms of being politicised, prejudiced, intolerant of diversity of thought, opposed to freedom of speech, and hostile to socially conservative views. So I have made it clear that the views I stated in that video I still hold and have continued to articulate them, as you've seen already in the letter, and I've articulated them publicly even during this week, and I will continue to do so in the future. Now, why do I take that stance? Am I just a sort of awkward customer? Well, no, I think there are three reasons that are motivating me with this. The first reason is the well-being of children, adults, and wider society. I think that's really important. I think the message I'm conveying here is part of a set of beliefs and values that would have a very positive impact on society, and their rejection will and is having a very negative impact. So I feel that would be a dereliction of duty for me if I was intimidated to the point where I didn't articulate these important points of view. But the second thing motivating me is a real valuing of freedom of speech. For other teachers in particular, who might be fearful of expressing their real views, but also more widely in our society. I think freedom of speech is under attack from many directions, and my approach is that there needs to be a fight back against these unnecessary restrictions wherever they occur. So that's partly what I'm doing here. And the third reason is more personal. I feel if I were to back down, if I'd backed down under pressure in the past from my employer, for example, and decided that I wouldn't really say what I believe anymore, I would just feel I would become a sort of hollowed out individual. My personhood would just wither away. And I feel as an individual, I can't live like that, not expressing what I really think. So for those three reasons, I'm persisting in expressing my views. So I'm certainly not here to apologize, to promise that I've reformed, or to sort of ask for mercy or anything like that, because I believe the views I expressed in the video and in the letter are not outlandish in any way at all. I believe the reason that the General Teaching Council for Scotland thus far has taken the view that they are outlandish is because the General Teaching Council for Scotland is embedded within the Scottish educational establishment, which is dominated by a very progressive, liberal, secular mindset. People might think, well, that's what almost everyone thinks. That's what all teachers seem to think. That's what everyone in education thinks. But of course, I would urge you to reflect on what happens when someone steps out of line. And you can see the example of what's happened to me. So people who do share these opinions, or some of these opinions, they are deterred from expressing them to a very large degree. Now, the next thing I'd like to move on to is something I touched on in my cross-examination of the witnesses, and that was by demonstrating how my views expressed in that video are exactly the teachings of the Catholic Church. So I'd like to read some passages. They're very, very short. This is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Techniques that entail the dissociation of husband and wife by the intrusion of a person other than the couple, by the donation of sperm, are gravely immoral. Techniques that entail the dissociation of husband and wife by the intrusion of a person other than the couple, for example, by donation of sperm, are gravely immoral. Now, note that that's not my words. I didn't use those words in the video, but I'm just demonstrating that the official teaching of the Catholic Church, as laid out in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 2376, Article 2376, if you'd like to look it up on the Vatican website. So that's the teaching of the Catholic Church. Now, I made a comment in the video. They haven't produced this baby together. This baby is the product of Ruth Davidson and a gentleman whose identity is a mystery to us. So in that statement, I'm merely pointing out the fact that, if you like, another person has intruded into the production of the child. So I'm pointing out that this point from the Catechism of the Catholic Church applies in this situation. And that statement of mine is now reproduced in evidence against me in the what's it called? It's not accusation. What do you call it?
Allegations.
Allegation. That's it. Sorry. In the allegations. Okay. Right. Moving on. Again, reading from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. These techniques, heterologous, artificial insemination and fertilization, infringe the child's right to be born of a father and mother known to him and bound to each other by marriage. I'll read that again. These techniques, heterologous, artificial insemination and fertilization, infringe the child's right to be born of a father and mother known to him and bound to each other by marriage. Now, personally, I didn't know the meaning of heterologous when I first read this. It means from outside of, so from outside of the couple. So this is again from the allegations. I said the important issue here is the deliberate production of a fatherless child. Now, I'm hoping you can realize that what I said there is not roughly, not approximately, is exactly the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. Exactly. Right, moving on to the allegations against me from the General Teaching Council for Scotland. Children have got a right to a mum and a dad, a male role model and a female role model within the home. Okay. Going back to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, these techniques infringe the child's right to be born of a father and mother known to him. So again, this is not roughly the teaching of the Catholic Church or something close. What I said is exactly, precisely the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. Even using the, I've got a right to a mum and dad. I wasn't familiar with the Catechism of the Catholic Church at that time, but it so happens I've used virtually exactly the same language that's in there. Okay, I will continue reading now from the allegations against me. So I reaffirm my view that same-sex parenting is not ideal. These techniques infringe the child's rights to be born of a mother and father known to him and bound to each other by marriage. So again, absolutely straight down the line, reflecting the teaching of the Catholic Church on that issue. Right, number 5, again from the allegations. If finance is really the reason why Ruth Davidson and her same-sex partner did not get married, then I think it shows that Ruth Davidson seems more concerned about the wedding, the celebration of the occasion, the splashing the cash on that rather than on the marriage, which is actually the important bit, which costs very little. So my statement there is, could be seen as criticizing Ruth Davidson for not getting married before the child was born. Catechism of the Catholic Church infringe the child's right to be born of a father and mother known and bound to each other by marriage. A child has a right to be born to a father and a mother bound to each other by marriage. So again, what I said is not just vaguely related, whatever. It is straight down the line, categorically identical to the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church in making that point. I'm using the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I'm not a Catholic, I'm using that because the Catholic Church happens to be particularly good at writing down what it believes clearly, but it's also the belief of very many Christians as well. Right, moving on to the conclusion of the allegations against me. It's suggested that my comments infer this. They infer that I'm saying that same-sex parenting is inferior to and is of less value than heterosexual parenting and should be discouraged as it is harmful to children. That's the allegation. The suggestion is that the meaning of my comments was that. Okay. But again, looking at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it very clearly says that same-sex parenting is not ideal. And it does say that it infringes children's rights to know and be brought up by the married mother and father. Right, moving on. The accusations also made that my comments would lead to the conclusion that homosexuality is undesirable. So GTCS has got me here in this hearing, fighting for my career, for allegedly saying that homosexuality is undesirable. And I'll just read to you Article 2357 from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Basing itself on sacred scripture, which presents homosexual acts as acts of grave depravity, tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. They are contrary to the natural law. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. They do not proceed from a genuine affective and sexual complementarity. Under no circumstances can they be approved. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that the Catechism of the Catholic Church is far more hard-hitting and forthright than anything as I said in that video. Far, far, far more. So, I mean, if I'd have actually read that in the video, I mean, I would be in even more hot water with the General Teaching Council for Scotland, I suggest. Within the Scottish educational establishment, there is an official philosophy of parenthood and sexuality. Why do I describe that as the official philosophy? For example, if you look at the government's sex education resources, rshp.scot, from nursery, they're presenting the message, any and every form of family is equally valid. We should celebrate the diversity of family forms. Families come with two mums, two dads. Any number of adults, men and women, can be a family. From age 5 to 8, they're taught about artificial reproductive techniques. They're given equal prominence with heterosexual intercourse as ways of making babies. So this message is the official line of the Scottish educational establishment, which is a very uniform group, is in direct contravention of Orthodox Christian teaching and the teaching of a lot of other religions as well. So this case is on the fault line between a position that's adopted throughout the Scottish educational establishment, perhaps with the exception of Catholic schools or some other small exceptions, compared to the teaching of, as I say, the Orthodox teaching of the Christian faith. So what I believe we're encountering here is an attempt by the state to promote a value system that is diametrically opposed to, for example, the traditional beliefs of Catholics. And I believe the General Teaching Council of Scotland is a part of this educational establishment that is also dominated by this mindset. And that's why my views seem so outrageous, because they're outside this value system that has been promoted as official policy within Scottish education. That the General Teaching Council of Scotland, as the witnesses were, they'd be very reluctant to actually come out and say, yes, that's right, a teacher may not state the views that are in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. That would be a bit too controversial, wouldn't it? They'd be in hot water. So what I believe the General Teaching Council in bringing this case is trying to do is to effectively do that, to see to action taken against me because of my views. But they'll want to try and muddy the waters so it's not quite clear cut that it's about any particular views in particular, its tone, its style, its context. Whereas actually, I think it's quite apparent that the issue here is the content of what I said. It's the controversial message that I said, which does reflect the teaching of mainstream Christian churches. During this time, when the school was putting pressure on me, at one point I wrote to the school with some opinions, and I said, could you give me your view? Am I allowed to say these things or not? And one of them was, abortion is immoral. And the headmaster replied, as you saw. Part of his reply said that it could contravene General Teaching Council for Scotland standards. And I saw that and thought, well, that's just completely ridiculous. The General Teaching Council for Scotland surely is not going to tell a teacher they're not allowed to state that abortion is immoral. So I arranged for a meeting with the General Teaching Council for Scotland, had a conversation with someone, and they confirmed in the conversation that, yes, it could be seen as contravening professional standards to state that abortion's immoral. I asked for that in writing. The General Teaching Council for Scotland was very reluctant to provide that in writing, but eventually I did get that in writing. I then did that, spoke to the Catholic Bishop's Office, and they made a press release about it. And the Times and the Mail were going to run the story. The two journalists phoned up General Teaching Council for Scotland. Now, when I asked them about abortion is immoral, I was absolutely clear. I'm talking about, for example, on social media, in a letter in a newspaper. To one journalist, the General Teaching Council for Scotland said, oh, we thought he meant within school. And to the other journalist, they said, oh, by outside school, we thought he meant standing at the school gate addressing a group of parents. Now, again, I think that was just sheer dishonesty. It was just an appalling lack of integrity from the General Teaching Council for Scotland. But the real underlying issue here is the General Teaching Council for Scotland was willing to put itself on record as saying that stating, again, an article of the beliefs of the mainstream Christian churches could be seen as contravening their professional standards, which again, I think is an outrageous situation. And I made General Teaching Council for Scotland aware of that, but there was no satisfactory response. The reason I'm raising this is it indicates the standards of judgment of General Teaching Council for Scotland. They are quite happy to take action merely on the basis of someone expressing mainstream Christian belief.